Hi class, this is Steve again, and sorry for the delay there. I wasn't aware it was running. This is kind of the second part of the video for the beginning of week 2. What you're looking at right in here is week 2 in the modules page. There's a PowerPoint that I made a while back about chapters 2 through 4 of Understanding by Design. Also, you have 3 things due this week. Normally, there's nothing due on Mondays, but I'm asking you to do this personal statement, get that out of the way, and also your 100-point project proposal so we can be moving ahead with those, because the proposals are the guts of what you do for this course. And I want you to have plenty of time to do those. And then discussion 2 is the normal prompt. And remember my advice to, for most of you at least, to cut down on your word count because you're being too thorough. You're like answering every question about every chapter and that kind of stuff. Just be more global, especially in part 1 of that. Okay? With this PowerPoint, I would use it as a pre-reading to kind of whet your appetite with some questions about the Understanding by Design reading. You could also go back and use it as a review afterwards, and you could also use it as some prompts for what to kind of zero in on in your writing. If there are 1 or 2 things that kind of pop up in the PowerPoint and you remember reading about those and being interested about that, go ahead and zero in on those in your writing your discussion forum. Okay, I'm going to make this a little bigger so that I can talk to you directly. And I've got my notes about some comments about the books. Okay, first of all, in Curriculum 21, a couple of things to keep in mind as you're reading is why do we have the disciplines or the subject areas divided up the way that we do? I think that probably goes back hundreds and hundreds, maybe 1,000 years. In the previous PowerPoint, I talked about the trivium and the quadrivium. We've obviously added language arts in English and things like that. So it seems to me, though, that what we have right now, like a book on math and a book on social studies and a book on, literature or something like that, could be very arbitrary, and there may be a totally better approach. And I think the thematic instruction and integrated thematic instruction, some of those movements right before the standards movement took over everything else. I think some of those other movements we're looking at, is there a better way to divide up the curriculum? Okay, so be thinking about that. Another thing that you could be thinking about is, why do we schedule the way we do? Why do we put students in the groups the way we do, even grade levels and stuff, instead of like maybe more ability grouping or something? Why do we divide up our learning spaces the way we do? You may work in a building that has more of an open space or a more or at least a media room or a technology room that you can go to where students can plug in their devices and share their screens with a small group, on tables around the walls or something like that with a screen mounted on the wall. So, we're experimenting with different groupings and spaces. Are there more effective options for this century compared to the factory model and the efficiency going down the assembly line model that we had from the early 1900s and the Industrial Revolution? A guy named Taylor actually was a consultant for factories, and then he went into schools and used the same techniques and strategies, and that's why a lot of the 2-story brick school buildings from the early 1900s look just like the factories of the time. Okay, so you can be thinking about those things with the the C21 chapters, and they're both written by by our author Heidi Hayes Jacobs. And then after this, she'll start having guest authors for each chapter for a while through the book. Okay, in UBD, what's the difference between goals, objectives, understandings, and essential questions? These are all buzzwords, but I find that not everybody means the same thing by these things. For example, Bloom, famous for Bloom's taxonomy, uses the word understanding for one of the lower levels of not critical thinking. Just factual recall and understanding are not critical thinking, according to him. You have to get up into application, analysis, evaluation, synthesis, creating those things in order for it to be critical thinking. So that is not the low-level definition that our UBD authors, Wiggins and McTighe, they're using understanding in a much more lofty way. So do you see the difference? And which way do you want to use it? What makes sense to you? They think of it in a much more deep way, probably in the way that the Hebrews used the word, some of the Old Testament Bible passages about having deep knowledge, is much more than just understanding facts. So what do you think of that difference? And then how do you think the standards movement relates to UBD? The authors talk about dovetailing some of the goals of the standards movement with their goals, but what would happen if the standards movement goes away, as it seems to be starting to do? And when I was in college, they said that for 100 years, education fads and education philosophies had kind of swung back and forth like a pendulum every 20 years. So you've got whole language on one side, and then 20 years later, you've got a real emphasis on phonics, in the 60s and stuff, and basal readers, and then you had more whole language coming up in the late 70s and early 80s, and then you had the standards movement, and some states even made it illegal to use more of a whole language approach. You had to use phonics in every school. But the standards movement kind of kept the pendulum on one side for more than 20 years, like 30, but there's evidence that it's unraveling. For example, parents in California aren't sending their kids to school on test days, and teachers all over America are asking, how do you grade a standardized high-stakes state test if literally the kid threw up on the test from nerves and anxiety? So we're building a lot of anxiety into the standards, and I think we're going to see some alternatives and some new approaches. And I think it's happening already from those examples and others. So what's going to replace that, and how is UBD going to try to be able to dovetail with whatever you see coming down the pike? More STEM teaching, more holistic, more problem solving, more character transformation, things like that. How do you see UBD fitting into that? Another thing that they said was that they're very teacher focused. So how does that fit into the normal tension between being curriculum focused as a teacher versus being student focused? Where does teacher focused even fit into that? And what if you really believe in being student centered as a teacher? So how do you see UBD fitting into, being student centered, being curriculum centered, being balanced, being teacher centered? They're obviously saying the teacher is the professional, needs to make the curriculum decisions. You're not just, in one of the canoes with the kids going down the river and seeing what happens and seeing where the river takes them. nor are you a drill sergeant and saying this is the way we've always done it, so you're going to do it this way. Which way do you see it? What's your metaphor for teaching, and how does UBD fit into that? And then they have a chapter on 6 facets, and I really think the 6 facets map onto the step idea of a taxonomy, like Bloom's taxonomy. But the last 2 or so of the 6 facets aren't really as cognitive as Bloom's 6 steps or 6 levels in the cognitive domain. So does that mean that the 6 facets also include some elements from the affective domain, which we hardly ever talk about, and it's really hard to assess, or much harder to assess than just do kids know this stuff at a low level. And going forward, what do you think of the 6 facets? Would you want to replace Bloom's taxonomy with the 6 facets? So have fun doing the readings. Maybe zoom in on some of those stories. Some of those aspects. I will put this little outline up as kind of a welcome to week 2. Enjoy the reading. There's a little story about John Dewey visiting a classroom, I think, in one of the chapters in UBD, where the teacher was very proud that she was doing recitation. This is like in the 40s, I think. And a kid could stand up and spout off the official definition for igneous fusion, the rocks that are so hot in the center of the earth that they're ignited and they're molten lava, essentially. But Dewey could see that the student really had no personal connected understanding of this and, was going to forget this Latin, basically, definition. And so he comments on that in one of his books, and I think they pick up on that. Okay? So enjoy that. Think about it. Think about whether this is truly a revolution in planning or just a different way to, just literally just putting, your sequencing of planning steps in a different order, planning backwards. I think they would want to think that it's a whole new way of looking at planning. So see what you think. And if the book is new to you, then it's probably a new way of looking at it, and I'd be interested in knowing, what you think of that. Okay, wow, that's 12 minutes. I thought it would be like 3. So I hope that helps a little bit, and feel free to contact me if you have questions about the reading or the assignments. And if you want to have a phone meeting, a Zoom meeting, or even if you're close within driving distance of Sioux Center, we can meet in person in my office. To talk about your projects or how your projects can relate to your school, or how you can, team up with somebody, or just, whatever you want. I want the projects to be as relevant and as useful to you this fall as possible. Okay? Have a great week, and hope to hear from some of you. Bye.